The chill in the Olympian Room at Ethelgard, Manhattan's most unapologetically exclusive restaurant, was not from the air conditioning. It was a frigid, soul-deep cold that emanated from the polished rosewood table, where a $10 billion deal was dying a slow, agonizing death. On one side sat Julian Croft, founder and CEO of Croft Industries, a man forged in the steel mills of Pittsburgh who had clawed his way to the pinnacle of the tech world. His face, usually a mask of rugged determination, was tight with a barely contained fury. Across from him, Herr Dieter Wagner, the patriarch of Wagner Precisionstechnik, sat with the rigid posture of an old-world monarch, his pale blue eyes holding a look of profound, unyielding disappointment. For 4 excruciating hours, communication had fractured, then crumbled, then ceased altogether. The interpreter, a man with a prestigious degree and an even more prestigious hourly rate, had been dismissed 2 hours prior, his confidence shattered by the intricate dialect-heavy technicalities of Wagner's Swabian German. Now silence was the main course, and desperation was the only thing being served. Ethelgard was designed to be a sanctuary from the vulgarity of the outside world. Its hand-knotted Persian rugs drank the sound of footfalls, its damask-draped walls swallowed whispers, and its staff moved with the spectral efficiency of seasoned phantoms. Alara Vance, tray balanced on one palm, felt the room's toxic silence the moment she pushed through the leather-padded service door. She wasn't supposed to be in here. The Olympian Room was the domain of senior staff, men and women who had served presidents and royalty. But tonight, a sudden bout of food poisoning had sidelined the designated waiter, and Alara, with her quiet competence and knack for becoming part of the furniture, had been thrust into the breach. The manager's words had been a plea and a threat. Don't speak, don't make eye contact, don't exist. Just clear the plates and get out. From the corner of her eye, she saw him, Julian Croft. His image was plastered across business magazines, a modern titan. In photos, he radiated a restless, predatory energy. In person, he looked like a caged wolf, his knuckles white where he gripped a water glass, the ice within long since melted. Next to him was his son, Marcus, the company's chief strategy officer. He was a stark contrast to his father, impeccably dressed, Ivy League smooth, and radiating an anxious energy as he surreptitiously tapped at his phone beneath the table. Opposite them sat the Germans. Herr Wagner, a man in his early 70s, possessed a stillness that was more intimidating than any outburst. It was a silence filled with the weight of history, of a company his grandfather had founded with little more than a dream and a single lathe. His 2 associates, engineers in their 50s, mirrored his granite stoicism. Their plates of pan-seared halibut, a dish that cost more than Alara's weekly rent, remained untouched, a silent testament to the evening's catastrophic failure. Alara knew the whispers from the kitchen. This was the final meeting, the last chance to merge Croft's innovative but volatile software empire with Wagner's legendary, unshakable German engineering. The deal was supposed to be Julian Croft's magnum opus, the move that would secure his legacy. Instead, it was becoming his public humiliation. Her job was mechanical: remove the untouched main courses, refill the water glasses, and vanish. As she moved with practiced invisibility around the table, she could not block out the pathetic, fractured attempts to bridge the linguistic canyon. The future, Julian Croft said, his voice slow and unnaturally loud, as if raising the volume could somehow conjure understanding. He held up his phone, showing a graph of projected growth. Big. Very big. Herr Wagner glanced at the screen with disdain before murmuring to his colleague in a low, rumbling German. The colleague replied, his tone sharp as broken glass. Alara, her hand hovering over a bread plate, froze for a fraction of a second. She understood every word. He shows us these childish pictures, Wagner had said. He thinks our legacy can be purchased with charts made by a boy. The colleague, a stern-faced man named Gunther, had replied, It is the American way. They have no past, so they can only sell the future. All gloss, no substance. A flush of heat crawled up Ilara's neck. It had been 5 years since she had been immersed in the language, 5 years since it had been the center of her universe. German was not just a skill for her, it was a lost love, a ghost limb that ached with the memory of what might have been. Her entire life, her academic ambitions, her planned future, all had been built around the complex, beautiful architecture of German philosophy and language, a future that had been stolen from her, leaving her in this gilded cage, clearing away the evidence of a cultural collision caused by men who were brutalizing the very things she had revered. She continued her silent orbit of the table, her body on autopilot while her mind spun. She saw her doctoral dissertation, half finished, on a forgotten hard drive in her cramped Queens apartment. Heimat and handwork, the linguistic symbiosis of community and craftsmanship in Germany's post-war Mittelstand. It sounded so impossibly grand now. She'd been the star of Columbia's Germanic Studies department, a prodigy on a full scholarship, destined for a professorship. Then a single phone call had vaporized that life. Her mother's diagnosis, a rare, aggressive cancer. The scholarship had no clause for indefinite leave. The life of the mine was a luxury she could no longer afford. It was replaced by the brutal, immediate calculus of medical bills, rent, and the need to care for her younger brother, Sam. She'd taken the first job that offered flexible hours and cash tips large enough to keep their heads above the crushing tide of debt. She had traded Kant and Heidegger for halibut and Chardonnay. Suddenly, Marcus Croft leaned forward, brandishing his phone like a weapon. "Father, I have an advanced translation app, enterprise level, and I took 2 years of German at Wharton. Let me try." Julian Croft looked at his son with the hollow eyes of a man who knew he was already defeated, but had to play out the final humiliating moves. "Do it. Anything." Marcus cleared his throat, a nervous, self-important sound. He angled the phone towards Herr Wagner and spoke, his accent a clumsy butchering of the language, his grammar an unforgivable mess. He was attempting to explain a complex point about supply chain integration, but what emerged was a jumbled, nearly incoherent string of words that sounded like a parody. Ilara had to physically restrain herself from wincing. It was worse than wrong. It was profoundly insulting. He was using the informal "du," a form of address reserved for family, close friends, children, and pets, when speaking to the deeply traditional Herr Wagner. It was the linguistic equivalent of throwing an arm around the old man's shoulders and calling him buddy. Wagner's piercing blue eyes narrowed. He said nothing, but a single muscle in his jaw twitched violently. With deliberate, almost ceremonial slowness, he picked up his heavy linen napkin, folded it into a perfect square, and placed it on the table beside his untouched plate. It was a gesture of absolute finality. A period at the end of a sentence that declared the evening, and the deal, was over. Julian Croft saw it. The last vestige of his composure shattered. He didn't shout. He didn't slam his fist. He placed his palm flat on the table and pressed down, a quiet, intense pressure that made the crystal glasses tremble. "This is a fiasco," he hissed, his voice a low, venomous thing, shaking with the kind of rage that comes from utter helplessness. "Billions of dollars, 5 years of my life, evaporated, all because no one in this goddamn room can form a coherent sentence in German." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy enough to suffocate. The weight of failure pressed down on every person, a physical presence in the air. Ilara stood frozen by the service station, the heavy silver tray in her hand suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She was trapped, an unwilling spectator at a corporate execution. She saw the deal dying. She saw the American frustration and the German disgust. But she heard something else too. She heard the silent screams of misunderstanding, of two worlds colliding not out of malice, but out of a profound, tragic ignorance. And in that moment, a reckless, terrifying, career-ending idea sparked in the ashes of her abandoned ambitions. An idea that could see her humiliated and thrown out onto the street. Or just maybe, it could change everything. The air in the Olympian room was now thick with the sour taste of defeat. Julian Croft's contained explosion had ripped away the last thread of corporate decorum, exposing the raw, ugly truth of their impasse. He was breathing heavily, his face pale, his gaze flicking between the stony-faced Germans and his own dejected son. He looked like a king who had just lost his empire in a game of cards. Herr Wagner pushed his chair back. The sound of the heavy wood scraping against the marble floor was a mournful groan, an unmistakable signal of departure. His two associates began to close their leather briefcases with crisp final snaps. The end had arrived. "Please," Julian said, the word cracking with a desperation he clearly despised. He looked at Wagner, a plea in his eyes. "Herr Wagner, there must be a way. This is a technicality. The numbers work. The logic is sound." Wagner looked at him, and for the first time, an emotion other than disdain crossed his face. It was pity, which was somehow worse. He replied in German, his voice calm and measured, directed at his colleagues but intended for the whole room to feel its weight, even if they couldn't understand the words. Ilara, standing motionless by the wall, felt the sentence land like a physical blow. "The logic is irrelevant when the trust is absent," Wagner stated. "They have not shown us the courtesy of understanding our principles. How can they be trusted to protect our legacy?" Marcus Croft, driven by a foolish need to redeem himself, held up his phone again. "Father, the app says he's concerned about the trust foundation. It's a bit vague. Maybe he's talking about the financial underpinnings?" It was a pathetic, literal translation that completely missed the soul of the statement. Marcus had taken a profound declaration about honor and legacy and reduced it to a piece of corporate jargon. "The foundation? What the hell does that mean?" Julian growled, his frustration mounting. "Are we talking about the building? The company's founding date? What?" "I think he means the basis of the deal, sir," Marcus stammered, sweat beading on his upper lip. "The groundwork for respect." He was making it worse, digging the grave of the deal deeper with every fumbled word. He was taking Wagner's worldview, a philosophy built over a century of meticulous craftsmanship and community loyalty, and running it through a cheap digital filter, presenting the pixelated, soulless result as the real thing. Ilara watched the disaster unfold. This wasn't about vocabulary, it was about values. Croft and his son saw a transaction, a merger of assets and intellectual property. For Wagner, a man whose grandfather had personally trained the fathers and grandfathers of his current employees, this was a covenant. It was about Vertrauen, a deep, almost sacred concept of trust that could never be captured by an algorithm or a Wharton MBA with a C. In conversational German, she felt a surge of academic indignation. This was her field of study being desecrated. These were not just words, they were vessels carrying history, culture, and meaning. Marcus was smashing the priceless vases and showing his father the broken shards, claiming it was the complete picture. Her own life had been shattered by the weight of words. The carefully chosen, gentle words she used to explain to her brother Sam why they had to sell their mother's house. The cold, unforgiving words on the hospital bills. The patronizing words of her academic advisor explaining that her scholarship was being revoked. "The department can't afford to wait for your personal circumstances to resolve, Ilara. We need to award the funding to a candidate who can fully commit." Words had destroyed her world. Maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild someone else's. Wagner was now on his feet. His associate stood with him. He gave a short, formal nod, a gesture of dismissal that transcended language. "Mr. Croft," he said, the two English words sounding stiff and alien on his tongue. Julian stood up, his face ashen. He had lost. Years of relentless work, of strategic acquisitions and brutal competition, all culminating in this quiet, humiliating surrender. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. What could he possibly say? Ilara's feet felt nailed to the floor. Every instinct, every rule of her job, screamed at her to stay invisible. A waitress was a ghost. She was there to serve, not to participate. Getting involved was professional suicide. They wouldn't praise her. They would incinerate her for her audacity, for witnessing their utter failure. She would be fired on the spot, and Sam was counting on her paycheck for his community college textbooks. But then, as Wagner began to turn away, Gunther, his aide, muttered a final, scathing remark to his colleague, a low whisper not meant to be overheard. "Wie ich es vorausgesagt habe, amerikanische Hybris. Sie glauben, die Welt müsse sich an sie anpassen. Ihnen fehlt jede Tiefe." As I predicted, American hubris. They believe the world must adapt to them. They have no depth. That was it. That was the spark on the tinder. It was no longer about a $10 billion deal. It was about pride. Not Julian Croft's pride, but something more fundamental. The pride of the scholar she once was. The pride in the very concept of understanding, of bridging the chasm that everyone else had given up on. Before her rational mind could chain her down, before the terror of unemployment could paralyze her. Ilara took a single, deliberate step forward out of the shadows. Her voice, when it emerged, was not loud, yet it sliced through the funereal silence of the Olympian room with the chilling clarity of a scalpel. She didn't look at Julian Croft. She didn't look at his son. Her eyes were fixed on the retreating back of Herr Dieter Wagner. And in flawless, formal, academic German, she spoke. Verzeihen Sie die Störung, Herr Wagner, aber die Tiefe, die Sie vermissen, ist nicht abwesend. Sie ist lediglich falsch übersetzt worden. The world stopped. For 5 full seconds, the only sound was the faint, expensive hum of the climate control system. Ilara's words, crisp and perfectly enunciated, hung in the air like a struck chord. Excuse the interruption, Herr Wagner, but the depth you are missing is not absent. It has merely been mistranslated. Dieter Wagner froze mid-stride, his body going ramrod straight. Slowly, with an almost mechanical deliberation, he turned his head, then his entire body, to face the source of the impossible voice. His eyes, which had been glaciers of dismissive contempt, were now wide with pure, unadulterated shock. He stared at Ilara, this young woman in a simple black uniform, as if she had just recited the secret name of God. His 2 associates were equally stunned, their mouths hanging slightly open. The American side of the table was a portrait of utter confusion. They hadn't understood the words, but they understood the seismic shift in the room's atmosphere. They saw the Germans' astonishment, and that shock was more potent than any communication that had transpired all night. Julian Croft's face cycled through a series of emotions: bewilderment, then sharp irritation, and finally a tidal wave of incandescent fury. Who was this? A waitress? How dare she? How dare she interrupt this corporate wake? What the hell is going on? He demanded, his voice a harsh growl. He jabbed a trembling finger toward Ilara. You! What did you just say? Ilara's heart was a trapped bird hammering against her ribs. Adrenaline roared in her ears like a furnace. The sheer, terrifying audacity of her action washed over her, and for a dizzying second, she felt her legs might give way. She had spoken. She had crossed an invisible, inviolable line. She, the servant, had entered the conversation of kings. But she kept her gaze locked on Herr Wagner. Her expression was respectful but unwavering. The scholar in her had taken control, the part of her that knew this was not an act of insubordination, but the presentation of a thesis. Wagner took a hesitant step toward her, his eyes scanning her face, searching for an explanation to this surreal turn of events. He replied in German, his voice no longer flat, but laced with a cautious, disbelieving curiosity. Sie sprechen Deutsch? You speak German? It was not a question so much as a statement of profound disbelief. Ja, mein Herr, Ilara replied, maintaining the formal address. Ich habe es studiert. Ihre Sprache, Ihre Philosophie, Ihre Ingenieurskunst. Sie sollten mein Lebenswerk sein. Yes, sir, I studied it. Your language, your philosophy, your engineering art, they were to be my life's work. The phrase, mein Lebenswerk, my life's work, was chosen with surgical precision. It communicated a level of devotion that went far beyond a college minor. It was a password, a signal to Wagner that she was not a mere translator. She was an initiate into the very soul of his culture. On the American side, confusion was curdling into rage. Marcus, what are they saying? Julian snapped, rounding on his son. Marcus looked pale, his confidence completely gone. I don't know, Father. Her accent is very thick. It's some kind of regional dialect, I think. It was not a dialect. It was pure, crystalline High German, and Marcus's inability to even recognize it laid bare the pathetic inadequacy of his earlier claims. Julian Croft's eyes, however, were now locked on Ilara, a dangerous light dawning in them. "You," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Waitress, what is your name?" "Ilara Vance, sir," she answered, her voice miraculously steady, though the hands hidden behind her back were shaking uncontrollably. "Miss Vance," Croft said, his tone dripping with sarcasm and threat, "you are fired. Collect your things and get out of this room. You have no comprehension of the damage you have just done." He started to turn back to the Germans, intending to offer a final, groveling apology for the bizarre interruption from his hired help. But Herr Wagner wasn't looking at him. He was still looking at Ilara. He held up a hand, a clear, authoritative gesture for Croft to be silent. He addressed Ilara again in German. "You said the depth was mistranslated. Explain yourself. What was misunderstood?" This was it, the precipice. She could apologize, scurry away with her termination, and disappear back into the anonymity of her life. Or she could leap. She took a deep breath. "Your colleague," she began, her German flowing with an academic precision she hadn't summoned in years, spoke of American hubris, of a lack of depth. While I understand his frustration, which is born from a complete breakdown in communication, to label it hubris is to mistake the symptom for the disease." She paused, letting the carefully constructed argument find its mark. Wagner's expression had transformed into one of intense intellectual focus. He was no longer looking at a waitress. He was listening to a lecture from a peer. "The issue here, Herr Wagner, is not a lack of depth, but a fundamental difference in corporate teleology," Ilara continued, her confidence growing with each sentence. "Mr. Croft and his team view this merger through a lens of disruptive innovation, shareholder value, and quarterly growth. It is a transactional worldview focused on the future. You, Herr Wagner, and your company, which has borne your family's name for over a century, view it through a lens of legacy, craftsmanship, and a trust, a vertrauen, that is meant to span generations. It is a covenantal worldview rooted in the past. He is speaking the language of finance. You are speaking the language of philosophy. And until this moment, you have had no one to interpret the meaning, only the words." When she finished, the room was so profoundly silent that she could hear the frantic thrumming of her own pulse. She had done it. She had diagnosed the core of the conflict that millions of dollars in consulting fees and high-priced lawyers had failed to identify. And she had done it while defending the very man who was in the process of firing her, to the man he had offended. Julian Croft stood there, a statue of impotent fury and confusion. He knew something extraordinary was happening, but he was locked outside, a deaf man at a symphony. Herr Wagner stared at Ilara for a long, unblinking moment. Then he turned to Julian Croft. For the first time that night, he spoke to him in slow, heavily accented, but perfectly intelligible English. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice a low, commanding rumble, "I do not think we will be leaving after all." He then gestured, not with a dismissive flick, but with a respectful inclination of his head towards Ilara. "And this young woman, Miss Vance, she is not fired." He pointed to the empty, ornate chair at the head of the table, the one vacated by the disgraced interpreter. "She will sit." The command was absolute. She will sit. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, no one moved. Julian Croft looked as if Wagner had physically struck him. He, the CEO of Croft Industries, in a private room he was paying a fortune for, had just been publicly countermanded by a foreign competitor regarding the employment status of his own staff. The power dynamic in the room hadn't just shifted, it had been violently and completely inverted. The first to react was not Croft, but his son, Marcus. A flicker of something ugly, jealousy mixed with panic, crossed his face. This unknown girl had just succeeded where he had spectacularly failed. But it was Julian Croft who held the room's attention. He was a man accustomed to absolute authority, and that authority had just been challenged in the most bizarre way imaginable. His jaw worked silently as he processed the impossible situation. His entire deal, his legacy, was hanging by a thread, and that thread was now held by a waitress whose last name he hadn't known 3 minutes ago. Finally, Croft gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't agreement, it was a strategic concession, a temporary retreat in a battle he was losing badly. His eyes, when they met Ilara's, were chips of ice. They held no gratitude, only a cold, calculating warning. This had better work. Still in a daze, Alara walked from the shadowed safety of the service station to the gleaming rosewood table. The few steps felt like crossing a continent. She was acutely aware of her practical, rubber-soled work shoes on the priceless rug, a stark contrast to the hand-stitched Italian leather of everyone else at the table. She pulled out the heavy, velvet-upholstered chair that the failed interpreter had occupied hours before and sat. The cheap polyester of her uniform felt coarse and alien against the chair's opulence. She folded her hands on the table, her waitress instinct screaming in protest at the terrifying new reality of her position. "So," Wagner said, reverting to German and addressing Alara directly, his tone now that of a professor beginning a Socratic dialogue. Mr. Croft was speaking of the future, of synergy, a word we Germans know, of course, but his meaning was hollow. "Tell me, Miss Vance, what is his vision? Explain it to me, not in his empty corporate phrases, but in a way that a man who builds things with his hands, a man who honors his grandfather's name, would understand." Every eye in the room swiveled to Alara. Julian Croft's gaze was a potent cocktail of suspicion and grudging necessity. He was trapped. His empire now rested on the shoulders of this young woman. Alara turned to him. Her voice was quiet but carried the weight of the room. "Mr. Croft, Herr Wagner asks you to explain your vision for the synergy between your companies. He asks that you do so not as a CEO speaking to an acquisition target, but as one craftsman speaking to another." Croft blinked, momentarily thrown. He was accustomed to speaking in the language of EBITDA, market disruption, and shareholder returns. "A craftsman?" "Yes, sir," Alara affirmed. "He values things that are built to last. He needs to understand what you intend to build with him, not just what you intend to buy from him." This reframing of the question was like a key turning in a lock. It bypassed the corporate jargon and went straight to the heart of the matter. Croft was silent for a long moment, the formidable gears of his mind visibly turning. He looked at Herr Wagner, truly looked at him for the first time, not as a stubborn obstacle, but as a fellow creator. "All right," he said, his voice changing. The raw anger was gone, replaced by a focused intellectual fire. "All right, tell him this." He began to speak and Alara began to translate, but she was doing more than translating. She was transmuting. When Croft said, "We will leverage your zero-tolerance manufacturing protocols to streamline our agile development pipeline," Alara didn't just echo the words in German. She paused, processed the intent, and then conveyed the soul of the idea. "Herr Wagner," she would say in German, "Mr. Croft sees the discipline of your workshops not as a rigid process to be exploited, but as the stable foundation upon which his company's rapid innovation can be safely built. He imagines it as a perfectly calibrated engine. Your precision is the hardened steel of the engine block. His innovation is the volatile fuel. One provides strength and permanence, the other, power and speed. Without the other, both are useless." As she spoke, a visible transformation occurred in Dieter Wagner. His rigid posture softened. He leaned forward, his eyes alight with genuine intellectual curiosity. He began to nod, not out of politeness but out of true comprehension. He started asking questions, sharp, technical questions about material science, software integration, and the philosophy of quality control. Croft in turn responded with a passion for his own work that had been buried under layers of executive aggression. He spoke of the elegance of his code, the beauty of a perfectly optimized algorithm, and with every complex exchange, Alara was the bridge. She didn't just swap nouns and verbs, she found the correct cultural and technical metaphors. She transformed Croft's talk of market disruption into the German concept of Vorsprung durch Technik, advancement through technology. She converted his aggressive user acquisition strategies into a more palatable discussion of building a long-term, loyal customer community. She was home. The years spent poring over dense texts, of dissecting the works of Schiller and Goethe, of writing papers on the philosophical underpinnings of German industrial identity. It was all flooding back, not as abstract theory, but as a powerful, practical tool. This wasn't a translation. It was a live performance of her abandoned dissertation. She was connecting the two worlds, revealing the shared values that had been lying dormant beneath the rubble of their conflict. Marcus Croft watched, his face a mask of disbelief and festering resentment. With every fluent, elegant sentence Alara constructed, his own humiliating failure was thrown into sharper relief. He had tried to be the hero who saved the day. Now he was less than a spectator. He was a monument to the very problem she was solving. After an hour of intense, productive conversation, a different waiter, one of Ilara's colleagues, hesitantly approached the table to clear the long-forgotten dinner plates. He stared at Ilara, sitting at the table with the titans of industry, his face a comical picture of bewilderment. Ilara gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head, and he beat a hasty, confused retreat. Finally, Wagner raised a hand, signaling a pause. He looked from Croft to Ilara, and the faintest hint of a smile touched his lips. He spoke in German. "Miss Vance, there is a section in the final pages of the proposed contract. Our lawyers call it paragraph 22. I call it the Meisterbrief clause. Mr. Croft's son has dismissed it as antiquated and sentimental. His legal team wishes to strike it from the document. This has been the primary point of contention for weeks. I want you to explain it to Mr. Croft. Explain why it is not sentimental, but the very soul of this agreement." A bolt of ice shot through Ilara's veins. The Meisterbrief clause. She was a waitress, not a mergers and acquisitions lawyer. She had no idea what it was. The fragile confidence she had painstakingly built over the last hour threatened to shatter. "Sir," she said to Croft, her voice wavering for the first time, "he's referring to a specific part of the contract, paragraph 22, the Meisterbrief clause. He says your team wants it removed and that it is the main reason for the impasse." Croft's face darkened instantly. The Meisterbrief clause. It's a page of nostalgic nonsense about funding some traditional apprenticeship program. It commits us to hiring quotas and training methodologies from the last century. It has no place in a 21st century tech company. It's inefficient. Marcus was right to flag it. Our lawyers want it gone. Ilara felt herself caught in the crossfire of the single most critical disagreement of the entire merger, and she was utterly out of her depth. The pressure in the room, which had dissipated, suddenly refocused with laser intensity right on her. The brief camaraderie of the last hour evaporated, replaced by the cold reality of a legal standoff. "Tell Herr Wagner," Croft said, his voice clipped and impatient, "that our human resources department has state-of-the-art training programs. We will honor his company's history with a plaque in the lobby, but we will not embed inefficient, backward-looking mandates into a multi-billion-dollar contract." Ilara took a steadying breath, her mind racing. A direct translation of Croft's dismissive tone would detonate the fragile peace she had brokered. She turned to Wagner. "Herr Wagner," she began in German, choosing her words with extreme care. "Mr. Croft acknowledges the historical significance of the Meisterbrief. However, his advisors are concerned that its traditional structure may not integrate seamlessly with the agile operational framework of the parent company. They propose honoring the spirit of the clause through a modern corporate training initiative rather than a direct contractual obligation." She had softened the blow, but the message was the same. The clause was a deal breaker. Wagner listened, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he didn't reply. Instead, he reached into his briefcase, retrieved a single sheet of paper, and slid it across the polished table to Ilara. It was a copy of paragraph 22, written in dense German. "Read it, Fräulein Vance," he commanded. "Read it not with the eyes of a lawyer, but with the eyes of a scholar. Then you will understand." Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the paper. The text was not dry legalese. It was, as Croft had said, almost poetic. It spoke of the company's duty not just to its shareholders, but to its community, its Heimat. It stipulated that the Wagner apprenticeship program, the Meisterbrief, would be preserved and funded in perpetuity. It was a commitment to training the next generation of local craftsmen, not as mere employees, but as custodians of a tradition. It was a promise that the factory would never become a soulless automaton, but would remain the beating heart of the town that had grown up around it. It wasn't inefficient. It was a covenant between a company and a community. It was the very soul of his company, codified. It was everything her dissertation had explored. They didn't just build components, they built citizens. They didn't think in fiscal quarters, they thought in human generations. Croft's team saw a liability. Wagner saw a sacred promise to his grandfather. Then Alara saw it. At the bottom of the page was a small typed annotation, initialed MC. It read, "Client's emotional sticking point, redundant with corporate HR. Recommend removal for efficiency gains. Core value is sentimental, not quantifiable." MC Marcus Croft. Her eyes flickered to him. He was watching her, a drop of sweat tracing a path down his temple. He had been the one to review the clause. He had been the one to frame it for his father's lawyers. And he had taken the profound German concept of Meisterbrief, a master craftsman's certificate, a symbol of honor, skill, and tradition, and reduced it to the dismissive English word sentimental. He hadn't just failed to translate, he had actively editorialized, stripping the clause of its immense cultural weight. Whether through ignorance or a deliberate attempt to streamline the deal for his impatient father, the result was the same, a catastrophic misrepresentation. He had diagnosed the heart of the company as a benign tumor and recommended its removal. This was the source of the infection. The misunderstanding hadn't started tonight in this room. It had been festering for weeks, seeded by this shallow, ignorant memo. "I understand," Alara said softly, looking up from the paper directly into Wagner's eyes. Her voice was now filled with a quiet, unshakable authority. She turned to Julian Croft. "Sir, with all due respect to your legal team, they have been operating under a profoundly flawed interpretation of what this clause represents. The man who advised them," she cast a deliberate, pointed glance at Marcus, who visibly flinched, "labeled this clause as sentimental. That is not a translation error, sir. That is a failure of cultural intelligence so fundamental, it borders on sabotage." "What are you talking about?" Croft demanded, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't just an apprenticeship program, Mr. Croft," Alara explained, her voice ringing with the passion of her lost academic field. "The Meisterbrief is the bedrock of his company's identity. It's a social contract. It's a promise to the families in his town that this merger won't strip mine the company for its assets and discard the community that built it. He isn't asking for a plaque, sir. He's asking for a guarantee that you will become a custodian of a century-old trust. This entire negotiation, this dinner, all of it, it has been a test. He needed to know if you were a partner who would protect his legacy or just another corporate raider who would devour it." The room was utterly still. Alara had just performed open-heart surgery on the deal, laying bare the deep-seated blockage that had been killing it for weeks. She had reframed the entire conflict, transforming it from a legal squabble into a profound test of character. Julian Croft stared at the paper, then at Alara, then at his son, who now looked physically ill. The pieces were slamming into place in his mind with the force of a battering ram. The weeks of friction, the reports from Marcus about the stubborn and emotional Germans, the inexplicable resistance, it all suddenly made a terrible, clarifying kind of sense. He had been fighting the wrong battle, on the wrong terrain, because his own son had given him a faulty map. Finally, Croft looked at Dieter Wagner. All the anger and frustration had drained from his face, replaced by a dawning, grudging, and profound respect. He had been tested, and he had been failing spectacularly. "Ask him," Croft said to Alara, his voice low and serious, "if he would do me the honor of allowing me to explain how I intend to be that custodian." Alara turned back to Dieter Wagner, her role shifting once again. She was no longer just an interpreter of words, but a facilitator of truth, the chief architect of a bridge being built across a cultural canyon. "Herr Wagner," she relayed, her German formal, yet infused with the gravity of the moment, "Mr. Croft wishes to express his deepest regrets. He confesses that he has been viewing this sacred document through the wrong lens. He asks for the honor, the airy, of explaining to you not his legal position, but his personal commitment to becoming a custodian of the trust your family has built." The use of the word error, honor, was the final key. It resonated with the deepest chords of Wagner's traditional worldview. For the first time all evening, the German CEO leaned back in his chair and gestured for Croft to speak. It was a sign of total surrender to the process, a sign that he was finally ready to listen. And so began the real negotiation, the most important one of Julian Croft's life. It was not about numbers or terms, but about principles. Prompted by Alara's nuanced framing of Wagner's concerns, Croft began to speak. He didn't talk about maximizing efficiency. He talked about his own grandfather, a man who had started a small tool and die shop in his garage in a soot-stained Pittsburgh neighborhood. He spoke of the pride of creating something real, of providing jobs, of being a pillar in a community. He admitted, his voice raw with a newfound self-awareness, that in the relentless pursuit of global expansion, he had sometimes lost sight of those foundational values. Alara translated it all, flawlessly capturing the vulnerability, the regret, and the sincere respect in Croft's voice. She conveyed it to Wagner not as a calculated business ploy, but as a genuine confession from one founder's grandson to another. "Tell him," Croft said, leaning forward, his hands flat on the table in a gesture of supplication, "that I see it now. Paragraph 22 is not a liability. It's the company's conscience. It's a quality control mechanism for its soul. And I will not remove it. I will sign it. And I will give him my personal guarantee, as a man, that I will uphold every single word." When Alara translated this, a stillness settled over the German delegation. Wagner studied Croft's face, searching for any hint of insincerity. He found none. The American CEO, who hours before had been a caricature of arrogant impatience, now looked like a statesman. Wagner then posed a series of sharp, insightful questions. What did Croft know of the dual education system? How would he ensure the plant manager in Germany had the autonomy to make decisions that benefited the local community, even if they didn't immediately boost the quarterly report? These were questions Croft's team had never even thought to ask. But with Alara there to provide the cultural context, Croft rose to the occasion. He didn't offer canned corporate platitudes. He offered creative, collaborative solutions. He suggested forming a joint legacy committee to be co-chaired by Wagner himself to oversee the implementation of the Meisterbrief clause. He proposed funding a new STEM program at the local German high school to feed into the apprenticeship. He wasn't just agreeing to the clause. He was embracing it, strengthening it. The transformation in the room was absolute. The frigid tension had been replaced by a palpable warmth of mutual respect and shared excitement. Wagner's two stern-faced associates were now smiling, murmuring to each other in appreciative tones. Finally, after nearly 2 more hours of constructive dialogue, Dieter Wagner stood up. Julian Croft and his son immediately rose as well. Wagner walked around the table until he stood directly in front of Alara. He looked down at her, his pale blue eyes no longer icy, but filled with a deep, sincere gratitude. "Fräulein Vance," he said in German, his voice resonating with emotion, "in my 72 years, I have worked with ambassadors, chancellors, and the most expensive consultants in the world. I can state without reservation that you are the most brilliant and effective communicator I have ever encountered. You did not just translate our words tonight. You translated our souls." He then switched to his careful English for all to hear. "You have saved this great enterprise." He turned to Croft and extended his hand. "Mr. Croft, we have a deal. Send the contract in the morning. Do not change a single comma in paragraph 22. Croft grasped his hand, a wide, genuine smile of relief breaking across his face. "You have my word, Dieter." The handshake was firm, the deal sealed. As the two CEOs shared a quiet laugh, Julian Croft's attention turned to his son. His voice, now devoid of all heat, was as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "Marcus," he said, not even looking at him directly, "Human Resources will have a package for you in the morning. Your services as Chief Strategy Officer are no longer required at this company." Marcus stared at his father, his face crumbling. "Father, please. It was a mistake." "It was not a mistake," Croft cut him off, his voice lethally quiet. "It was a failure of character. You took a shortcut. You showed contempt for a partner, and you almost cost this company its future. I am reassigning you. You're going to be assistant to the plant manager in Germany. You will enroll in the Meisterbrief program. You will learn the language properly, and you will learn what it means to build something with your hands. You will learn what honor and legacy actually mean. In 5 years, if you have proven yourself, you can reapply for a junior management position. If not, you are out. That is my final word." Marcus looked as if he had been physically struck. Without another word, he turned and fled the room, a ghost leaving the scene of his own demise. The path of destruction carved by his ambition was finally clear, and in its place stood Alara, the quiet waitress who had single-handedly resurrected a $10 billion legacy. Julian Croft now turned to her, his expression a complex tapestry of gratitude, embarrassment, and awe. "Miss Vance," he began, "I believe we need to discuss your future." The aftermath was surreal. The Germans, now warm and effusive, were sharing a celebratory glass of schnapps with Croft. The oppressive tension had evaporated so completely it felt like a hallucination. Amidst the bonhomie, Alara sat, a quiet island of disbelief. She had walked into this room to clear plates and was walking out having redrawn the map of two global corporations. After seeing the Germans to their car, Croft returned to the now empty Olympian room, where Alara was waiting. He pulled up a chair and sat across from her, not as a CEO to a subordinate, but as an equal. "I was wrong, he said bluntly, his voice free of its earlier arrogance. "I was dismissive, I was rude, and I fired the single most valuable asset in this entire negotiation. I apologize." "It's all right, Mr. Croft," Alara murmured, still processing the whirlwind of the last few hours. "You were under immense pressure." "That's an excuse," he countered, waving it away. "Pressure reveals character. Mine was lacking. Yours was extraordinary. What you did tonight wasn't just about knowing German. You understand the why behind the what. That's a rare gift." He paused, studying her. "I had my assistant do a search while I was talking with Dieter. Columbia University, doctoral candidate, Germanic studies, full scholarship, top of your class." He shook his head in wonder. "What happened?" The question was direct, but the tone was one of genuine curiosity, not judgment. For the first time in years, Alara felt no shame as she told her story. She spoke of her mother's illness, the mountain of debt, her brother Sam's future, and the dissertation on German industrial philosophy left to languish on a hard drive. Croft listened without interruption, his gaze intense. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "You sacrificed your dream for your family," he stated. "It wasn't a question. That's honor. That's legacy. The very things I was too blind to see in Wagner's contract. You've been living them every day." He stood up. "I'm not going to offer you a job, Miss Vance. That would be an insult to your talent. This is a deployment. I am creating a new position at Croft Industries, effective immediately. Director of International Communications and Cultural Integration. It's a senior role reporting directly to me." He saw the shock on her face and pressed on. "This isn't a reward. It's a necessity. I need you to ensure we never walk into a room this blind again. I need someone to be the custodian of our conscience as we grow. The starting salary will erase your family's debt and pay for your brother's education, with plenty to spare. And the company will fund the completion of your PhD on your own schedule. We'll hire a tutor, a research assistant, whatever you need." Alara stared at him, speechless. "Director?" The words seemed to belong to another language. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Just say yes," Croft said, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "Frankly, Miss Vance, after tonight, I think we both know I need you far more than you need me." An hour later, Alara walked out of Ethelgard for the last time. The cold New York wind whipped at her face, but she barely felt it. She was no longer an invisible waitress. She was Alara Vance, the woman who understood the poetry of engineering, the one who could hear the silent language of a company's soul. Her past was not a tragedy that had derailed her life. It was the crucible that had forged her. And her future was no longer a question of surviving until the next rent check, but of striding into boardrooms and ensuring that no one's truth, no matter the language it was spoken in, would ever again be lost in translation.